Thank you. We can go ahead and jump into the session and get this conversation going. I'm incredibly excited about this conversation and specifically this panel for a number of different reasons. So thank you all for attending the 2022 Mental Health Equity and Liberation Summit hosted by No More Martyrs. The name of this session is Critical Race Theory Matters to Mental Health. If you're receiving continuing education credit for attending this session, please make sure to sign in now in a sign-in link that's posted in the chat box. My name again is Dr. Nadia Richardson. I'm the founder of No More Martyrs. What I'd like to do now is ask our panelists to unmute and introduce themselves. Dr. Erevelles, if you'd like to maybe start it off.
Oh, no. Okay. Hi, and I'm Nirmala Erevelles, and I'm really excited and nervous to be here too, because I was just listening to the previous panel because I came on and I was so excited at the energy. So I hope our panel can have as much energy. I'm a professor in social cultural studies in education at the University of Alabama. And a lot of my work is in the areas of disability studies and race. I work in education, and so a lot of this panel is very exciting because my work is really looking at the ways in which race and disability intersect to produce particular kinds of identities for students. And I was particularly looking at issues of discipline, special education placements, lack of access to resources, and the school to prison pipeline. But I also do work in the broader context of the ways in which I do theorize the ways in which race and disability are what I call mutually constitute each other in ways that construct people, identities that then get oppressed in society, and to talk about ways in which we can build critical alliances across these different contexts. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone next?
I can go next. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Artie Nelson. I'm a child adolescent family psychiatrist here in Birmingham in private practice, but I also consult at several facilities, Gateway for foster care, substance use, Olivia's House, and also in Gadsden at the Quality of Life Center for their substance abuse program. I do a lot of lectures about diversity and racism, white supremacy. I teach a little bit at the UAB for their residents and fellows in psychiatry to help them deal with cross-cultural issues in the world of psychiatry, particularly in child psychiatry. So again, very excited to be here. Just want to contribute and learn myself. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda Fialk. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I also have a PhD in social work. I am a partner and the chief clinical officer at The Dorm, which is a young adult treatment facility located in New York City and Washington, D.C. So a little far from you all, but also really excited and honored to be a part of this panel. I think, the teaching of critical race theory is a mental health issue, and it's important that we talk about it as a mental health issue as it impacts the emotional well-being of young people, particularly young people of color.
Absolutely. So I want to go ahead and thank you in advance, each of you, for participating in today's discussion. I know it's going to be powerful because, I know and I'm familiar with the work of everyone on the panel. Some of you I know more than others. So I'm excited to jump into this. And plus, in my own circles, professionally and personally, this is a conversation that's been taking place over the past few years, right? There have been a number of debates around critical race theory that have captured national attention, and numerous states have approved various House bills to ban the theory in schools where they're not even traditionally taught. So it's kind of a fearful, direction in which House bills are being created. These bans have created an environment in which individuals who are in service-oriented fields such as teaching and mental health are cautious, if not even fearful, to incorporate intentional conversations about race and inequity in their work. So what I want us to do for this discussion is really explore what that means for the field of mental health and what opportunities there are to create spaces for us to have intentional, action-oriented discussions around mental health equity. So I want to start this conversation off with a question to you, Dr. Erevelles. While some are very fearful about critical race theory, it can be argued that most people don't really even understand what it is. So can you define it for us this morning?
And it's going to be easy and hard because I'm just going to give you a critical race theory 101. I teach a whole course on that in education, but I'm trying to be brief. Yeah. So basically, and that's the most ironic thing about critical race theory, the way it gets attacked by conservatives, is that actually critical race theory is a legal theory that was critical of the liberal legal system. You know, so that's also the first thing, like I want to point out there is like, it was critical of the ways in which the liberal legal system had put its faith, complete faith in the legal system to take away all kinds of inequities that occurred. And then there were Black legal scholars in the field who said, wait a minute, the law is not, in fact, outside of or averse to reproducing precisely the very inequalities that they are in society. The law, in fact, actually embodies them and reproduces them on a daily basis. And it was like, people also make it the critical race theory just started out of this kind of like radical Black tradition. In fact, the first aspects of critical race theory was actually critical legal theory, where they were actually white legal scholars, mixed race scholars too, really talking about class, like law. We know that the law looks at poor people in differential ways. And then the race scholars said, it's not just class, we also have to engage the category of race. And I'm just going to give you like literally the quick and dirty five to six tenets of critical race theory so that you know exactly what it is. And then we can have more questions on this in the Q&A. And the first thing that critical race theorists argue, I just want to name, first of all, let me name like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Mari Matsuda. These are like some of the famous people who actually constructed this theoretical foundation. And the first tenet of critical race theory is that racism is in fact very embedded in US society, that in fact it is written in the law. Because if you remember, the law is supposed to protect property and property rights. And the very logic of the production of US society was based on who owned property, who was property. And the legal system has continued to work on that. And, you know, the individual personal rights of their own body, who owns the property, like that, the whole debate about abortion, you know, figures around those things. So what critical race theorists said was race is a very like normal, all pervasive aspect in US society. And we know that even today because we still have segregated housing. I work in education, horribly segregated school systems. We're talking about mental health. We know how access is mediated through race. We know police brutality overwhelmingly is mediated through race. My own work in disability studies talks about the fact that Black disabled people are actually more so harassed and murdered by the police. So you see that this is very much a pervasive concept. The second thing they say is that race is a social construction because there's no biological category, like there's no biological thing to say that people from different races are different. It was a construction historically created to enable labor to occur and to justify that oppression. So it is a social construction, but just because it's a social construction doesn't make it unreal. The third thing it says is, I'm just making sure I remember all, is the fact that when we have had advances in race, this is what they call interest convergence, it means that it's only done to not just improve people of color's lives, but also the lives of well, actually, it will be the benefit of those in power. So like racial segregation, like Brown versus Board was done because we didn't want US to look bad during the 1970s, during the Cold War. We know that affirmative action, even though it was supposed to do a lot of benefit for African-American, minority communities, has actually predominantly benefited white women, which is not a bad thing. But I'm just saying that these laws, the interest convergence, that changes are made only if they also benefit the dominant community. And then the really other big issue that I'll talk about in length later, I mean, not in length, we can all talk about it because that's why we're talking about mental health, is the issue of intersectionality, which is the issue that the law cannot treat things as if there is just a single issue, that people are in fact multiply, there are different vectors of oppression that shape people's lives, right? You know, we just had a previous panel where people were talking, that's really what intersectional is, working at the intersections of gender identity, class identity. And it's not about adding identities together, but it's really about experiencing the ways in which different social structures shape individuals' lives if they have different identities in that context. And the last and the most significant one, and the one that I think is so powerful, and I think I really appreciate having this Martyrs conference today, is because the central thing of critical race theory was about counter storytelling in the law. In other words, you need to learn, you know, the law is all about precedent, right? What happened before? And when you do what happened before, you don't hear the stories of the people who are actively excluded. So the big part of critical race theory was listening to the stories of people who had been excluded, and then using those stories as examples for then explaining the ways in which the legal system excludes you. And now you notice in everything I've said, there's nothing about spewing hate. My daughter just graduated from high school, and I can swear to you, in the 12 years that she has been in public school, she has had no education. Actually, she's had a tragic education on issues of race. And so like this building up this bogeyman, which is only explaining the ways in which people who have historically been marginalized experience oppression, and to look for collective ways, not just within the communities, but across communities. That's why the intersectionality part is really critical, to see the ways in which we can build solidarity so that all people, I was listening in the previous channel, that all people can have, the previous presentation, I'm sorry, all people can have the sense of humanity, that we can redeem, we can see humanity in people. So it's very much not the kind of, we are going to tear down society, anti-establishment kind of argument that's being made. It's very much a transformative, collective, social solidarity kind of argument. And I may have spoken too much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that foundation, just so that we have an understanding of what critical race theory really is outside of what it has been characterized as over the course of a couple of years. Dr. Fialk, in a Psychology Today article titled "Why Teaching Critical Race Theory Matters for Mental Health," you stated that the pushback against critical race theory can manifest as yet another form of racial trauma for diverse clients. Can you elaborate on that thought?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, when I think about the pushback against teaching of CRT in school and an accurate portrayal of history in school, what we're really communicating to people of color is that their lived experience, their perspective, their daily struggle, past and present, doesn't matter. That it doesn't matter now, that it didn't matter then, and it won't matter in the future, that they don't matter. And when kids believe that they don't matter, that impacts their sense of self, their self-esteem, their confidence in their ability to be safe in the world, to succeed in the world. And that is an intense emotional and mental injury. That is a trauma. And when you couple that with hiding historical trauma on top of the current trauma, the cumulative toll that takes on a young person is profound, and the psychological wounds are are deep, and we know about intergenerational trauma and how it gets passed on. It's really important for young people, especially young people of color, to feel like their lived experience matters and that they matter.
Absolutely, absolutely. That all matters to our mental health. Dr. Nelson, what role can critical race theory play in contributing to the coping and resilience traditions of those who have historically and currently been impacted by race-related stress?
The main impact, I mean, I think, number one, I think it was very, very good how it was explained that what it is and what it isn't. And I think that's very important. I trained in Los Angeles, a very diverse community, and we were able to really see different cultures and give that history. What I did see was that if you don't, and I think that was eloquently explained about CRT, is that if you don't teach people about themselves, then their self-esteem suffers, and the trauma that was previously mentioned is also there. Example-wise, and Nadia knows me, I always talk about stories and examples. At my hospital, every grand rounds where we would meet with all the doctors every month, they would bring in, this was a predominantly Jewish hospital, Cedars-Sinai, they would bring in survivors from the Holocaust. And we would discuss that. And it would, I was wondering as a resident and asking questions, why every month they would bring this in. And I would ask my supervisor, and they would say, that's because we don't want to forget. And we don't want to forget because it empowers us to do more and to help others. And, even the younger residents were like, why? And they were Jewish. They were saying, why are they bringing survivors in all the time? But I say all that, that is very important. It doesn't teach kids to be feeling guilty about being white, which you hear that a lot. And then it doesn't make people of color feel as though they are victims. It actually does the opposite. I think it empowers people. We would do a group with individuals at Cedars to talk about their experiences in the school. And we would do that every week. And you'd be surprised about just how, even in a diverse community like Los Angeles, how difficult it was to talk about the stories of race and history. And when you give people that story, it empowers them. It actually does the opposite. So there's a lot of fear around it. I think it does affect their mental health. And as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, I've seen where once you're able to safely talk about it and get it out, it has the opposite effect. What I'm seeing currently is a lot of parents do want to talk about it. Number one, it did put it on the table. So now, with the pandemic and all, and you hear people say, well, all of a sudden, I found out what they were teaching my kids in school because we have homeschool now. But it really was an eye-opener for a lot of people, and a lot of people didn't know what CRT was, but now they do. But to answer your question, yeah, I can get long-winded too, but the main thing is it does help to bring it out. It does help to talk about it, and we got to have the conversation. It helps everyone.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Erevelles, you've already mentioned intersectionality and what that is. Can you talk about what intersectionality can do to contribute to a greater understanding of discrimination and privilege?
One of the biggest misunderstandings of intersectionality is actually Kimberly Crenshaw herself, who was the one who coined the term. Kind of critique was people try to do this, what we would call Olympic oppression, which is if I have got 20 different identities, then I'm at the bottom of the pile. And if you have only 2 identities or 1 identity, then you're on top of the pile. And so there was an assumption that intersectionality was really talking about adding identities to a particular conversation and then having this kind of oppression Olympics. But Kimberly Crenshaw was not talking about that. She was really talking about the fact of the ways in which, especially because remember she was talking through the legal framework, that you cannot treat any occurrence as if it is a single issue. You can't talk about race as if it is separate from gender, because Black women have experiences that shape them both as women and as racialized people. And those two things can combine in such a way such that they may experience oppression from different contexts, even within their own community. Like the very first book on Black feminism had a title that was All the Women Are White, referring to white feminism. All the Men Are Black, referring to the Black Power movement. But some of us are brave, which means that some people were caught in the context where their perspectives were not taken up. So in this context, in the particular context of intersectionality, we have to look at different vectors, and especially in the space of mental health, or in a very broader sense of disability, because my work is, I'm a professor in education, and I have seen what's happening in schools, which is that students with, like when we do, if we take it as a single issue, we notice that kids of color who also have disabilities, some of them with related to mental health, do not get the kinds of services, the supports, and the caring that they need because of the lack of access, because we read Black children who have some kind of mental health issue as not as if it's something to do with a health issue. It has to do with them being pathologically, and I'm using that word problematically, pathologically bad. And so what happens is, if you're well-to-do and a white child who has a mental health issue, you get access to services. If you're a kid of color and you have some kind of emotional breakdown, or you're angry, or you're anxious, or you're distracted, you get a label and you get pushed into either a behavior classroom, and that's where the school to prison pipeline goes along. Actually, for some of you who may know some of this, and I'm currently doing research, there are very few kids of color who have this 504 plan, which is a plan that is used particularly for children. Like in my daughter's school district, they work so hard not to allow the 504 plan to happen to kids, because it's not a federally funded plan. And because of this, kids of color do not get, like, if you, basically the 504 plan is if you have something that's not a physical disability, but it's mostly like, you know, anxiety, some kind of behavior issue, nervousness, ADHD, you are required, you must be still kept in the classroom. And if you have a behavior issue, they have to mediate it through the fact that you have a 504 plan. But most kids of color don't have access to it because they're poor. So that's where the intersectionality comes in. They don't have access to it because maybe their parents don't know that those are they can do this. And because there is a prevailing, this is the racism part, there's a prevailing assumption that when Black kids act out, it's because they're bad and it's not because they have a need. And so this is where intersectionality, like just to give you an example of the ways in which intersectionality works then. So if you actually, and I'll just say this one other thing was, like when you actually read about people, the majority of young people in prisons and juvenile detention centers is because these kids and even young people and even adults are at the intersections of race, disability, and class. And so ableism, racism, and classism work in ways to basically incarcerate you and sometimes lead to like lives that are basically are thrown away, right? So.
Absolutely. This is how all of these things work to build systems of oppression that are built into our institutions, including healthcare. So let me ask you this question, Dr. Nelson. Last year, the American Psychological Association issued an apology to Black, Indigenous people of color for promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism and racial discrimination in the field of psychology. Do you believe that critical race theory can contribute to APA's operationalizing an action-oriented response to structural racism and mental health? I know that's a big question. That was a lot.
Now, you know, I can't speak for the Psychological Association. I can share this with you that the actual APA, the American Psychiatric Association, also apologized. It had done basically the same thing. And the American Medical Association, who also denied access for people of color to join that organization, apologized a few few years back. So we're seeing a lot of that. I was just at the meeting for the APA in New Orleans this past May, and they had probably half of the seminars were about critical race theory and how it could affect, you know, people of color and people classified as white. One of my mentors is Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, who passed away in the late 90s, but she talked about racism as white supremacy. And that came up several times in the APA meeting in New Orleans about we have to really define what things are. And that's what it is. And that's the fear behind this. To answer your question, yes, I think they apologize. I think it's a good stepping stone. The APA has had some people who have left because as you get higher up in these organizations, it's still predominantly white male. And a lot of women, both white and Black, have left in protest of them not being able to advance higher in the organization. There is the Black Psychiatrist Association. There is the Hispanic Psychiatry Association. So there's a lot of divisions that have came out of that. But to answer your question, yes, it's clearly important. I think we got to look at some of the ways, like we said, intersectionality. I recently, preparing for this, I just happened to put on Netflix and saw Who We Are with Jeffrey Robinson. I encourage everybody to see that. It really was an eye opener. A lot of the information I knew, but I could imagine a lot of people hadn't known that information. And I've been encouraging everybody. I am going to try to have a discussion of that, have the video being shown and try to do a discussion. I think it's something we got to really sit down in the room and discuss. So I hope I answered your question. But yeah, I think the apologies are good. I think action is going to be, you know, what are you going to do about it, knowing that we stopped a lot of individuals from joining these organizations, but now that they are, what are you going to do to advance the discussion of race and critical race theory?
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Fialk, what advice do you have for parents who argue that critical race theory harms the mental health of their children?
Yeah, I think Dr. Nelson made reference to this, you know, this fear of white children feeling guilty and, you know, will they be able to handle the truth? And I have a couple answers. I mean, first, what I want to say is that if Black children are young enough to experience racism, children of color are young enough to experience racism, then white children can learn about it. And that teaching CRT in school will not make children feel guilty or ashamed. In fact, I actually think it's quite the opposite. You know, when I think about an educational environment, so much emphasis is placed on test scores and academics and learning that A squared plus B squared equals C squared, which I'm surprised I still remember, but all this emphasis is placed on that. And there's not enough emphasis placed on social and emotional learning. And one thing that is wonderful about CRT is that in order to teach children how to think critically, they need to develop empathy. And empathy is a skill. It is a social, emotional skill that needs to be and can be taught and practiced and honed over time. And what we know about empathy and the ability to have empathy, the ability to engage in empathic conversations with others, is that it is actually a protective factor when it comes to mental health and mental wellness. Those who are empathic and have this skill are able to engage in more satisfying interpersonal connections and relationships with others. What we know is that individuals who don't have healthy relationships with others are prone to isolation, which leads to depression, anxiety, substance use, and a whole other host of symptoms associated with mental illness. So by teaching critical race theory, all children benefit by learning these social and emotional skills, in particular, the skill of learning how to be empathic. So my answer to parents who are concerned that somehow teaching CRT will have a negative impact on mental health is that actually the opposite is true for all children, regardless of their identity.
I think that there are parents who could benefit from learning that, but also a lot of educators, you know, especially in the K through 12 system, a lot of educators who could benefit from understanding how this would contribute to all of the development of all of their young people. So
Yeah.
That's a whole other conversation. I've actually heard people, educators, mental health professionals, other people that said, well, maybe we could communicate that to them if we just didn't call it critical race, right? So like, it's just even the name in and of itself, critical race theory, like if we just moved away from that. And I think that there's merit to that argument. However, I've seen it argued from both sides. And I'll even use No More Martyrs as an example. From one perspective, when we launched our organization as No More Martyrs, there was actually a very notable nonprofit in New York that reached out to us and said, oh, this is great. I think the work that you're doing is wonderful, but if you could change your name, right? And it was just kind of like, well, we're intentional about why we chose that name, right? We really, the foundation of how we approach mental health advocacy is critical race feminism, right? Which is what I used in my dissertation research, and really thinking about the intersectional experiences of Black women, how mental health is manifested in our experiences. And so I was very intentional about that because of the concept of martyrdom that exists in Black feminism theory and critical Black feminism, or, you know, so I said no, and I thanked this individual for their perspective. I thanked them. But I said no. So while I've heard other people say, well, maybe if we didn't call it critical race theory, we could get a little further along. I also think labeling it as such, there's intent in there, right? Like to not shy away from the fact that this really is a in-depth conversation around how race impacts things on a much larger scale. So with all of that being said, I'm going to have another moment of transparency. Dr. Erevelles is actually one of my former professors. So I actually took a critical race theory class with her when I was in grad school a long time ago. It's been a while now, Dr. Erevelles. It's been a good minute. It's been a while. Maya was like this big and Cassie was in my arms. So the fact that I have a teenager tells you how it's been some time. And I will say this too, now that I have you on this call, is that all of the work that we're doing with No More Martyrs, all the work that I do in my diversity, equity, consulting work, in my position as a professor right now at a university in a biomedical sciences program, I hope that you see all of this as an aspect of your legacy, because I know, like, I hope that I'm not embarrassing you right now, but I know that when I get with my, friends, my other grad school friends, and we talk about who had a really huge impact on us, your name is in that mix, right? So appreciate you, celebrate you. One of the things that stands out about one of my experiences with you is that, as a grad student, you're going to a lot of academic conferences, you're presenting research, you're attending sessions, and you're doing all of these things. And I remember going to a conference, and I felt like every session that I attended that was speaking about the experiences of historically disenfranchised and marginalized populations, every one of them was using critical race theory. And at the time, I didn't know what it was, and I was incredibly suspicious of it, right? Because I was like, why is it every person who is here that's identifying as a person of color is speaking about critical race theory? Not one theory can capture all of our experiences. I was kind of thinking about it in those ways. And I remember coming back from that conference and coming to you and saying, hey, what is this? Before I even knew that you taught it, right? Like I didn't even know that, because I had taken other classes with you, but I didn't know that you had taught critical race theory. And you were like, oh, well, you know what? I teach critical race theory. I'll offer a class in the next semester, right? So that's how I ended up getting into this class. But what I appreciated about that exchange is that I learned about something, and then I was able to come to you and say, ooh, what is this? And how can I know more? And you responded by saying, okay, let's teach a class. Let me offer a class. What advice do you have for students? And this is all students, right? Future mental health clinicians, future educators, future advocates. What advice do you have for them on how to advocate for their own curriculum and their own development, because there's a lot of this material that's not a part of their required coursework, right? It's not a part of their required curriculum. And I'm saying that as someone now who is taught in a school of medicine. I'm currently in a school of health profession. So when you're talking about nurses and medical schools and different programs, a lot of these concepts related to inequity, intersectionality that all contribute to health disparities, you know, it's not a part of required curriculum. However, I am seeing a new wave of students who are asking for it, right? They expect to see it even though it's not there. So what advice do you have for students who come into a program, want to have these conversations, but don't see it and feel like they're not being prepared to be culturally responsive in all aspects of whatever field they choose to go into? What advice do you have for students on how to advocate to get that curriculum put into their schools?
And I would say one is you need to, first we need to ask, because like what you said, is like you're listening to these things and to really push the boundaries of knowledge, right, that you have. Because what we forget, I was like when we were talking about education in an earlier state, we were talking about, we get caught up in all these test scores and grades and, meeting requirements. Sorry, this is, okay, sorry. We forget about we don't ask, we don't get caught up in some of the things that are not in the exam. Part of the reason I can talk about this was just last night, I teach in a nurse, we also have nurse education as one of the programs which we jointly teach it with the College of Education. And just last night, I teach a multicultural class where I use critical race theory to the nurses, and it blows their mind because these are all people who have worked 20 or 30 years in the field and are coming back they're teaching in community colleges and other universities, and they want to, and I give them the, Washington's book on the medical apartheid. It blows their mind. It's like medical apartheid is about the hundreds of years of medical violence. That's what I'm going to call it, against Black people. And it's the history. It's part of the history of medicine that only now we are uncovering. And so that's the other issue, is sometimes students don't know that is what they need. Because you're also caught up in, the nursing curriculum is so set. You're only meeting these requirements. These questions are not asked on the NCLEX. So you don't get access to, you don't find this space to teach it. So it just blows their minds. And then I'm also teaching them an ethics class, which I did last night. And even there, to be able to understand notions of what does it mean to think about bodily autonomy for people of color? What does it mean to talk about what is ethical about access in a notion of the free market? You see what I'm saying? These are questions that come in, and then particularly around issues of mental health, because we have made, this is where my disability studies stuff comes really powerfully. We live in such an ableist society that we require a certain kind of normative presentation of self. Anybody who kind of moves away from that is already considered, but the entire education curriculum, education itself is geared towards normalization. My daughter just finished high school and was just trying to get into college. She got into college and she did well. But the thing was that whole, talk about mental health, that was it is she's a very good student, but I saw her feeling a sense of loss of confidence in the ways in which, universities brag on how much, what their, the smaller their acceptance rate, the better they are. The ways in which, you're not just okay to be just smart, you have to be brilliant. And my child is if my child who was very successful in school, who meets all the criteria, felt so beaten down, I knew she goes to the public school she went to was Title I and predominantly Black and Latina in the school, in the community that I live in. I knew the majority of her classmates couldn't even imagine, and many of them had kind of given up, and the kinds of despair that they have. So the part of our curriculum has to deal with, we need to be, when you say, what do we need to do? We need to, before you can even ask for what's going to be in the curriculum, you need to be aware of what these things are. And that's where this critical race, these kinds of coursework or some kinds of conversations or even your own observations? Why is it that there's such few Black students in nursing courses or in medicine? Or like I was hearing in the earlier one, can't find somebody from the LGBTQ plus community to do mental health counseling. Why is it that these communities are excluded? So we have to ask the question, part of the reason you got to where you are is because you were asking the questions, not to be satisfied with explanations that are given to you, which is also so contradictory in an academic context where we say we are free to think, but we all think in boxes, which is what I kind of constantly challenge my nursing students who are all like about, we fight for patient autonomy. And then I'm like, yeah, if you believe in patient autonomy, then why don't your everyday practices listen to the stories that marginalized patients tell you? Like you have it there, the ANA gives you those, they give you those things, they tell you what to do. You have the tools to be progressive, but you allow yourself to be in a box so that then you can't advocate for the coursework, you can't advocate for the thinking, and you can't advocate for the practices. So, yeah.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And when you were talking about the tenets of critical race theory and storytelling being one of them, yes. When I do have the opportunity to teach medical students or even talk to, students who are on that track to go to medical school, that's one of the things that often catches me off guard is that, they are inundated with this science curriculum, which is necessary. You have to know about biology, you have to know about neuroscience, you have to know about all of these things. But the practicality of what back in the day used to be called bedside manner, but really having the ability to come in and look your patient in the eye, to engage them with an understanding of who they are as a person, what support systems they have, what culture they're associated with, all of these things, evidence-based, we know that they contribute to patients adhering to a treatment plan, right? It actually has a direct impact on health outcomes of patients, but that's not a part of the required curriculum when it comes to training to go into those fields. And that is a part of this conversation in regards to equity, right? Like you can't meet someone where they are if you don't know how to engage them in a culturally responsive and culturally competent, inclusive manner. So we are going to be wrapping this session in just a few moments. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or into the question and answer box. I do have a question that I'd like to ask Dr. Fialk and Dr. Nelson, because this is really a question centered around those who are in the mental health field, right? So actual clinicians and practitioners. Anti-racism has become closely associated with critical race theory. So with that in mind, what steps can mental health professionals take to incorporate anti-racist ideas into their practice?
I can go first. I mean, I already kind of do that. I think, and to answer your question about Meharry, I went to Meharry, a predominantly Black institution. Howard and Morehouse do teach that in their curriculum as far as how to interact with patients of different cultures. And so we do get that grounding. You can almost tell when I'm teaching residents where they were trained on how they interact with people of color when they're seeing them in the emergency room or that sort of thing. So I do see that. But you said your question, back to your question, I'm sorry. So your question is how in the mental health field, anti-racism. Yes. Yeah, I actually do, when I see a patient for the first time, that is the first question I say is, how do you feel about seeing an African-American psychiatrist? And regardless if they're white, if they're Black, if there's, whatever culture, that's my first question. I learned that, years ago. And it does kind of break the ice as far as that goes, because you will find out a lot of people will be in therapy for years and that issue of race never comes up, and then they'll transfer it to another psychiatrist and say, yeah, I never felt comfortable with that therapist or that psychologist because they didn't understand my culture, blah, blah, but they never said anything. So they went on for months without actually bringing that up, or sometime even years. So I think it's very important to bring that up, to talk about that. I always reference different books for people to read in my sessions. I also tell them to watch different movies I'm a big advocate of and Nadia knows this, the hero's journey. So I have a series of DVDs that I will loan out or give to my patients to watch. Antoine Fisher, for example, is a very good movie to show about the whole system of being in the foster care system and what happens and the trauma, but also it's a hero's journey where he actually brings himself out of that and became successful. So I bring it up all the time. I think it's the elephant in the room every time, but a lot of people, even clinicians, are afraid sometimes to bring that up. And so everybody sort of is in this box and they pretend, everything is okay, even though we know that all this is going on, current events. I will sometimes bring up even current events that are going on. What do you think about what happened with George Floyd? I'll bring that up and see. And people have opinions about it. So I think it's important to get that right out in the beginning. So that's my approach to bringing anti-racism into the mental health field.
Yeah, this is a big question. I think, so for myself, I oversee an organization. So bringing in anti-racism practices, you need to look at it at a more macro level, and then also at a more individual level, how we're practicing and the interventions that we're using. But I think it's really important to look at a lot of different areas: hiring practices, your policy and procedure manuals, where are sort of white supremacist ideologies or principles seeping in, and naming that and making the necessary changes, providing trainings for the entire team so that they feel comfortable, competent, and able to provide affirming care for a variety, for anybody that walks in the door, and especially for historically marginalized groups, looking at the interventions that we use, because so many interventions that we learned in school are very sort of white-centric, Eurocentric, and it's important to really look at different types of interventions. One thing that I also think is hugely important, especially working with young adults, which is a population that I work with, teenagers, young adults, is that a lot of the work that we do with them, yes, it is therapeutic, it is therapy, but we also do a lot of skills-based work. A lot of our clients come to us with deficits in certain skills, whether it's certain executive function skills, social skills. Some of our clients struggle with time management, money management, all these skills that are really necessary to be able to, you need to build them in order to live, fulfilling and purposeful lives. And one thing that I think we also need to teach, particularly our white clients, is the skill, and again, I call it a skill, of how to be an anti-racist. What do you do when you see racism? Well, first of all, how do you identify racism in your spaces? And then what do you do when you see racism in your spaces? How do you be an upstander? Because a lot of young people, they want to say something, but they don't know what to say or how to say it. And they're not learning it at home. They're not learning it at school. And not only is it good for their mental health to be an upstander, because again, it's this empathy and having, effective relationships. It's also good for the person that they're, it's good for all parties involved, but it is a skill. And I think as a mental health treatment provider, it is our responsibility to be teaching that skill.
Could I add something?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
After the shooting in Buffalo in the grocery store, I had heard a pastor talk about, we really need to even call to our friends that are white when they see or hear something, say at a family gathering or something, and don't say anything. That's the worst, because they may be your good friend, they may, you get along, you go to happy hour and all that stuff, but they're not saying the things at home or in family gatherings when that uncle says something that's, clearly racist. And I think as long as we do that, well, I'm not racist, nobody wants to be racist. But, when you point that out, I think it helps, you know, and I said that can be an educational moment for that uncle. It brings up a discussion in the family about that. And my consulting at this substance abuse place, a lot of times we see the families will turn away the young lady once they've had a child by a person of color. So if you have a mixed race child, all of a sudden the money stops for substance abuse treatment. They don't get to go to the private places and all. Now they're at this public place. And I've seen this story over and over again where, you know, they will ask, I said, well, you know, you were in Vestavia and you went to a nice school and all this, and you went to Bradford and a couple of you went to Betty Ford. The family even paid $50,000 for treatment there. But as soon as they got pregnant by an African-American male, boom, they're shunned out of family. And you know, at first I was saying, oh, this is just isolated, but I've been doing it for about 10 years. You see the same pattern each time. And again, I think if we don't, this pastor was saying, if we don't talk about it to our friends and people that we feel are aware of it, or woke is the word has been used now, I think we fool ourselves, because they can go home to a family gathering or whatever and still that uncle every year is saying the same things, or that you know, oh, well, he's old or he grew up in a different time, but you're still perpetuating that same narrative over and over again. And, you know, and he was just saying, you know, he's tired of just sort of pretending that things are getting better when you know with your friends that things are still coming up and things are still happening, and you see these mass shootings and you see all this stuff, you know, still happening. So I just wanted to add that in because it was really very compelling when I heard it.
Absolutely, absolutely. We do have a participant question that's been posted in the Q&A box. The question is, any suggestions on how to teach white and privileged clinicians to become familiar with the continued, I think the word is become familiar with how to interrogate their own internalized racism. Any suggestions on how to teach white and privileged clinicians to interrogate their own internalized racism? There we go.
I'm very happy to go with that, because I teach in a predominantly white university, and majority of my students are predominantly white, and many of them are also very conservative and come from places where my students will tell me this is the first time they've ever had a discussion on racism openly with a faculty of color, maybe one or two students of color in the classroom. And the way it works is like, that's why you have to give people facts, or like I say, that's like the history. Those books on history are amazing. Our students are so not taught about what happens in the world around them. Like when I teach the undergraduate pre-service teachers, who are many of them come from Birmingham, from the very privileged communities. They've never been around people of color, and then they find themselves going to be in a classroom. So they have to understand, and they have this kind of, a lot of times when people work in the service professions and you're working with people of color, they see themselves as not having any kind of racism, because they're feeling that they're this kind of patronizing, we're doing these good things for poor people. So I have to break, so there is a way that you need to interrogate. That is what I call also internalized racism, because you only see yourself in a superior position. You don't see yourself as an equal to, or see the other people as equal to you. So that's when I use text, like I give them history. I allow them to think about the history. We open it. So like the first thing I always tell them is this is not about apportioning individual blame. That's the other problem. We talk about racism sometimes like it's my attitudes. That's why that argument about we need a little theory, like about thinking about it as structures, so that you can be like, there are some, and also we talk about it, there's sometimes people of color who are working in racist ways against their own people. It's not that we are all constituted by the structures that produce those things. So I always go with, like I said, my nurses, when I first meet my nursing education, they're like, we just deal one-on-one with patients. I'm good to every patient. I'm not a racist. Nursing is a medical school. There is nothing to do with racism. So then when they start reading medical apartheid, and then we start having those questions about how does it explain the ways you reacted? What were the resources? Why didn't we know? What are the assumptions that we've had around issues of race? It opens up a conversation then for them to situate their own. It's also, that's why that part also about when they say counter storytelling, it's also about the fact that, you know, people like even white people who are privileged don't have time to tell stories about their own supports around racism. So that's when those stories come out. We talk to each other, we work through it. That's the way you, I mean, that's one of the, I'm not saying the only way, that's one of the ways to engage it. The part of the issue is that people don't have, I also tell my students, usually when they're in a classroom space, we actually say, this is the safest space you can talk about race. I kind of like joke. I said, don't try and argue with me in a bar. I can get rowdy. But in a classroom space, we are supposed to be respectful. This is the safest space you could ever have to have the difficult conversations. And because I'm also teaching nurse educators, I'm also trying to teach them ways in which they feel comfortable to talk about race in their own classrooms, right? So I'm trying to model ways in which, and several of them say that they learn then ways to model. I mean, they're learning ways to be able to use the language. They need the language. Sometimes we don't have the language. Sometimes we feel uncomfortable. So the fact is, how do we make these conversations comfortable? Not in the sense that, oh, there's no pressure. My students get the classrooms my class can be tense. It's not about saying, and the part about guilt that Dr. Fialk was talking about, that whole notion of like people feel guilty, but like we also talk about why guilt is not a useful, I'm not teaching this because of guilt. We're teaching this because we need to see then the ways in which all of us, every one of us gets implicated in reproducing precisely the structures, whether we like it or not. So I don't even have, like I've stopped talking about the privilege stuff because then people start feeling whatever. I rather talk about the ways in which we all, you know, the normal, that's why I think disability studies helps too, because I kind of talk about the ways in which people understand class and disability normalization a lot better than race. And so I move from there to then talking about race becomes one of those other categories of the ways in which we exclude and what do we do to in fact work through those structures. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that response. Thank you for that response, Dr. Erevelles. And there's something that you said that actually ties into a quote that I would like to share. And I know her name has already been mentioned a couple times during today's discussion, but Kimberly Crenshaw is an American civil rights advocate and a leading scholar in critical race theory. And she's quoted as saying, treating different things the same can generate as much inequality as treating the same things differently. If we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. So I wanted to share that quote because it really did tie into what you're saying, that some of your students are saying is, oh, I'm a nursing, I'm a doctor, I go in and I treat everyone the same. And it's like, no, treating everyone the same can generate just as much inequality because you're not really seeing that person for who they are and understanding them for the various types of supports that they might need. So I want to go ahead and just thank our panelists so much. This has been such a good conversation. Like, this is such an important topic. I felt like it was a timely topic. I felt like we couldn't possibly talk about equity and liberation without really diving in and dismantling these ideas that exist about critical race theory that are not true, while also talking about some of the ways that critical race theory can benefit us in the work that we're doing in mental health space. So I would like to ask each panelist, just as we wrap, to give a final thought regarding today's topic. Any final thoughts?
I just want to say thank you, and that I'm glad that that these conversations are being had. These are vital conversations. We are in the middle of a mental health crisis right now, and people of color are disproportionately suffering, and we need to figure out ways to dismantle a system that's not working. and provide equitable care to all people who need care and need mental health services.
Yeah, I'd
Dr.
also
Nelson?
like to thank everyone for being here, and I enjoyed it. I can talk about this for for hours. I use role playing when I teach the residents. We will change roles and also use video. Jane Elliott, the classic brown-eyed, blue-eyed experiment. I show that video, and that's a very powerful one to show. So, but I just like to again thank everyone. I think it was very informative. I'm not an expert on critical race theory. Now I know who to go to for that. So that's great. So thank you again.
Yeah, I mean, these kinds of conversations always energize me because it's these are topics that are near and dear to my heart, and I just loved actually also being in contact. Like, I think I just love the organization that Nadia created and the kinds of people she brings here for that. But I want to end also on a very hopeful note, because of my, not just because my daughter was in high school, but also because I do work in like schools, I am so hopeful. Like, our kids are asking the critical questions, have been in like these, and the problem is us, the adults. Like in my daughter's school, which is, there's like, kids have been walking around claiming different kinds of sexual identities and gender identities, and they have critical discussions on racism, but they're having that outside, and the adults act as if nothing like this exists.
Yeah.
I see the hopeful, like, because my daughter was in the track team, so you're sitting there, in those other non-formal moments. The kids have imaginations, they're pushing the boundaries. My daughter's just got into her program, they're connecting with different people. She has classmates who are asking such critical questions. And then our legislatures are acting as if these are foreign conversations, that none of this matters. And that our kids are willing to push the boundaries of, they're questioning notions of normality. And that's why I think also that the argument that and the part of the problem that a lot of these things are happening, the mental health issues are because they're finding themselves in spaces where they want time and space to breathe. And we as adults are closing down those spaces for them to be able to do the breathing. So I want to end on the issue, like I was even at the previous panel that was here before, you hear the struggle, but you also hear the courage, the resilience, the hopefulness. And I want us to be able to, like, it doesn't matter what tools we use, that I want us to stay in those spaces and to recognize that and to see the ways in which, in whatever our fields are, to nurture that hopefulness and that possibility. So.
Thank you for ending on that note. Thank you so much again to our panelists. If you are a licensed mental health professional who is receiving CEs for this session, the session survey link is posted in the chat. So please feel free to log in and complete that survey so that your attendance is documented. Thank you again to each of our panelists. I will remain in contact. Dr. Nelson, Dr. Erevelles, I already know you well. Dr. Fialk, I've been reading your stuff. I'm so familiar now with the work that you're doing with the dorm, and I look forward to connecting and remaining in contact and exploring ways that we can collaborate in the future, because I believe the work that you're doing is powerful and important. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We are